However, everything changed on the 23rd of March, 1983. March 23rd, 1983, Reagan was given a page to read really towards the end of a speech that was talking about something else. It was an address from the Oval Office to the American people on television. And he talked about the possibility of going beyond the balance of terror. And of course, don't associate this with Reagan because he was simply the trained actor with a trained voice who was given this thing to talk about. But the idea is eminently worthwhile. What it meant was that if you were only relying on deterrence, you were getting to the point where that was becoming faultier and faultier and less reliable, and that is continued. In other words, there are ways to overwhelm, to smother a response. There are any number of things you can do to prevent this mutually assured destruction from being assured, right? In other words, to interfere with it. But what Reagan was talking about was the ability to make aggression futile, that it becomes pointless as well as self-destructive ultimately, but mainly pointless to launch a nuclear attack on another country because none of your missiles are going to come in. They're not going to be able to hit the targets. Now, again, we're not talking about the old-fashioned Sentinel, Sprint, Nike Zeus, anti-missile missiles. Those things are relegated to these parks that you have at the Redstone Arsenal in Alabama or other such places. Right? We're talking now about lasers, particle beams, new physical principles, and that was the heart of what was called the Strategic Defense Initiative (SDI) of March 23rd, 1983, and that then inside the Pentagon it became the Strategic Defense Initiative Organization, and I guess it's now called the Missile Defense Agency. It's gone through a number of changes. But it has never fulfilled the promise. It has never fulfilled the promise, partly because of the idiotic resistance of the Democratic Party. One of the worst things Ted Kennedy ever did was to call this Star Wars, right? He was first out of the gate saying, oh, Star Wars defense, Star Wars defense. Well, now it would be good if we had it because it is the basis of war avoidance at the present time. So there was an immediately a group that came forward and said, no, 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 we don't want to spend a lot of money and take a lot of time building lasers and other capable defenses. Let's use the off-the-shelf technologies that we have, kinetic kill vehicles, exploding warheads, things like this. And with that, we'll be able to throw something up there in a very short period of time, and then feel like we've done something. Because ironically, it's more than 30 years ago. It's 35 years ago almost, and that was their argument. This group was called High Frontier. I think the honcho there was General Keegan, a dubious character, but General Keegan of High Frontier made that argument. Off the shelf technologies. Well, the problem is, of course, that any system that depends on this inferior mobility and inferior firepower of kinetic kill weapons, in other words, when you want to collide something with the incoming missile, that can be overwhelmed. And we saw that just a couple of weeks ago, right? The U.S. staged this test showing that if it were a single ICBM coming in from the Pacific, the U.S., if they knew in advance it was coming, they could shoot it down. And this is kinetic. In other words, it's a collision. It's not an explosion. It collides. And it was pointed out at the time, as long as it's only one, you can do it. But what if it were 10 or 20 or 50? Then, of course, your defense would be overwhelmed. But what if it were a laser that could simply fire repeated shots because it's beyond this crude mechanical kinetic collision or even exploding warheads? Can go way beyond that, and it can defend. It can provide defense against an attack. Isn't that worth it? And I think that's where we are right now. If you look at North Korea, you have to say it is not a future worth having. to let this deranged madman dictate a future because of his whatever needs, political, psychological, whatever they are, and that his sponsors, right, his backers in Moscow and Beijing, should not be awarded that additional thing because they could say, "Oh, well, we're not threatening you. That's only Kim. You know, Kim. That's just Kim being Kim." Well, not good enough. And here's the thing that I would point out. Right now, Monsieur of Beijing and Moscow are sitting back there and saying, we've got the U.S. in a pickle now. Boy, we're going to fix their wagon because the U.S. are going to be hysterical. The Europeans will get scared, and the Europeans will begin to look to Moscow and Beijing for stability and reassurance and so forth. How much better it would be to go in there and say, well, we're appalled, of course. We're deeply disappointed that Kim has carried out this act of folly, violating all those UN Security Council resolutions. You got to throw that in because this means a lot to the Europeans, and in many ways it should. So what's the adequate response, right? Certainly not aggression. Don't meet aggression with aggression. No preventive attacks at the moment. No, that's not the way. Obviously, you want to do more in terms of cutting North Korea off from the SWIFT system, from the international payment system, which they can still access. And of course, you want to identify bad actors in China and Russia that have been helping with this program, and you want to sanction them. And that can work wonders. But the main thing would be to say, let's now create a world where petty tyrants, petty tin pot dictators like this madman Kim are simply deprived of the ability to threaten the world and to disturb international peace and security. It is not acceptable for them to be able to do this. Therefore, the United States is announcing a Manhattan Project. The Manhattan Project, similar to what went on in World War II when we needed to build a nuclear reactor, right? And the first atomic pile, and then the atomic bomb. We would do that this time, not from an offensive point of view, but from a purely defensive point of view. We're going to have the ability to shoot down large numbers of intercontinental ballistic missiles. At this point, Messieurs of Beijing and Moscow will go bonkers because this is what they fear. This is what Gorbachev stood on his head practically at Hofty House in Iceland back in the 80s to try to do anything to stop this strategic defense initiative because the Soviets felt that they couldn't match this. And we also have had it along the road, right? The constant idea that any recourse to anti-ballistic missile defense technology is a really bad thing. The U.S. broke out of the ABM regime. I would not have done that at that time, but it was done. Right now, it's a fact. It's a fait accompli. So we can't remake the history of the world. All we can do is try to do the best we can, given the situation as it now exists. But you will then see Russia and China screaming bloody murder, saying, "How dare you provide yourself with defensive means to block madman Kim?" I think we've gone through the argument before. If there's any country which is a perfect candidate for anti-ballistic missile defense, it is Republic of Korea, Seoul, South Korea. This is a perfect example. In other words, you have a crazy neighbor who threatens you with a gun, and you don't want to live like that. So what you've got to do is find a way to make his gun absolutely ineffective. And what we can say about South Korea obviously applies to Japan, Republic of China on Taiwan, other U.S. bases, of course, in these areas, and ultimately the U.S. too.